The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the Springfield Police Department. It was a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary Tuesday that would later be marked in history as the day everything changed. Officer had just finished his shift, clocking out at exactly 4:47 p.m., the same way he had for the past 28 years. He was a creature of habit, predictable and reliable, the kind of cop that younger officers looked up to with admiration and respect. His face was weathered by decades of service, his salt and pepper hair kept in a neat military cut, and his eyes carried the weight of countless decisions made in the field. Walked through the precinct corridors, nodding to colleagues at their desks. He stopped by the break room where Detective Frank was pouring himself a cup of black coffee, their third cup of the day as usual. "Going home early?" Frank asked, surprised to see leaving before sunset. It was unlike him. Usually stayed late, reviewing case files, mentoring younger officers, or simply catching up on paperwork that never seemed to end. "Yeah, Susan wants me home for dinner tonight," replied with a tired smile. "It's our anniversary, 30 years. He spoke the words with a mixture of pride and weariness, as if the weight of 3 decades of marriage and policing had finally caught up with him. Frank raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "To the most dedicated cop I know. Susan's a lucky woman," had laughed, but there was something hollow in the sound, something Frank would later remember with chilling clarity. As walked across the parking lot toward his unmarked sedan, he didn't notice the figure watching from across the street, partially concealed behind a delivery truck. He didn't notice the black SUV that had been following him intermittently for the past 3 weeks. Was thinking about Susan, about how beautiful she still looked after 30 years, about the restaurant reservation he'd made at their favorite Italian place. He was thinking about how he'd been meaning to tell her everything, to finally unburden himself of the secrets he'd been carrying. But he'd hesitated. Fear had kept him silent. The parking lot was nearly empty by this hour. Most officers had already left for home or were out on patrol. Unlocked his sedan and slid into the driver's seat, adjusting the mirror and starting the engine. He sat for a moment, letting the car warm up, his hands gripping the steering wheel. His chest felt tight, a sensation he'd been experiencing for days now, a pressure that came and went without warning. He dismissed it as stress. Too much coffee, too many sleepless nights, too much worry about things he couldn't control. He was pulling out of his parking space when it happened. The pain hit him like a thunderbolt, explosive and immediate. It radiated from his chest, spreading through his left arm and up into his jaw. Gasped, his hands convulsing on the wheel. The car swerved violently, his foot instinctively pressing on the brake. The world began to spin, colors bleeding together in his vision. He couldn't catch his breath. Each attempt to inhale felt like drawing in broken glass. "No, no, no," whispered, his voice barely audible. He fumbled for his phone with trembling fingers, managing to dial 911 before his hand fell away from the device. His vision was darkening at the edges, tunneling down to pinpoints of light. The last thing he clearly heard was the dispatcher's voice asking his location, then the sound of his car door being wrenched open by concerned colleagues who had witnessed his collapse. Detective Pierce was the first officer to reach him. "Stay with me," screamed, already pulling out his own phone to ensure emergency services were en route. Within seconds, 3 more officers surrounded the vehicle, shouting instructions, checking for a pulse. Had performed CPR on countless people, but never on someone he knew, someone he respected, someone he called friend. The paramedics arrived within 7 minutes, considered excellent response time in any city. They rushed onto a gurney, their hands moving with practiced efficiency, oxygen mask secured over his face, IV lines placed in his arms, monitor pads attached to his chest. His heart was in chaotic rhythm, fibrillating dangerously. The lead paramedic, a woman named who had transported twice before during his career, barked orders to her partner. "We're losing him," charging to 200. The defibrillator paddles were placed on his chest. His body convulsed with the electrical shock. For a moment, just a brief, hopeful moment, his heart rhythm stabilized on the monitor, but it was fleeting. Within seconds, the erratic patterns returned. Again, 300 joules, commanded. Another shock, another moment of hope, another crushing disappointment as the monitor continued its alarming dance. "Come on, not today," whispered, performing manual chest compressions with desperate intensity. "Not today, you hear me." But the universe doesn't listen to prayers, and fate doesn't respect the righteous. By the time the ambulance pulled into Springfield General Hospital, had been without adequate circulation for nearly 20 minutes. His brain, deprived of oxygen, was beginning to suffer irreversible damage. At the hospital, the emergency room team worked on him for another 45 minutes. They tried everything: medications, more defibrillation, advanced cardiac life support protocols that had been perfected over decades. Dr. James Mitchell, the attending physician, stood over his body, observing the desperate efforts with the grim expression of someone who had watched this scene play out too many times before. The monitor showed a flat line, asystole, the ultimate enemy of emergency medicine. "Call it," Dr. Mitchell finally said, his voice heavy with resignation. His eyes moved to the clock on the wall. "Time of death, 5:43 p.m. The machines fell silent. The rushing energy of crisis care evaporated, replaced by the stillness of finality. Stepped back from the gurney, her shoulders sagging. She'd known for 5 years, seen him at community events, spoken with him about life and work. And now he was gone just like that, with no warning, no time for goodbyes. Susan received the call at home while she was setting the dinner table. "Mrs., this is Springfield General Hospital. I'm calling about your husband, officer. I'm very sorry, but—" The words after that became a blur of meaningless sound. Her hands released the wine glasses she was holding, and they shattered across the floor, sending ruby liquid spreading like blood across white tile. Her knees gave out. She collapsed against the kitchen counter, the phone falling from her ear, repeating the question that no amount of time would ever adequately answer. Why? 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 Within hours, the police department was in chaos. Officers gathered in small clusters throughout the precinct, their faces pale, their eyes red-rimmed. The news spread like wildfire through Springfield. 28-year veteran, beloved mentor, devoted husband and father was dead at age 56. Cause: acute myocardial infarction. Suddenly, shockingly, without mercy. But what no one knew yet, what Susan would eventually discover, what would lead her down a path of dangerous truth, was that death was far too convenient. It was far too perfectly timed. And it would set in motion a series of events that would expose corruption so deep and so widespread that it would shake the entire foundation of the Springfield Police Department to its core. The dog, Rex, sensed it first. That evening, as Susan wept alone in their home, the German Shepherd lay at the foot of the stairs, unmoving, his eyes fixed on nothing, as if he understood that his world had fundamentally and irrevocably changed. He didn't yet know what had happened, didn't yet understand that his partner would never come home, but Rex knew something was terribly, catastrophically wrong. And very soon, he would communicate that knowledge in a way that would change everything. Rex hadn't always been a pet. For the first 8 years of his life, he was K9 Officer Rex, serial number 847, a German Shepherd with an impeccable record and a legend that preceded him throughout law enforcement circles across 3 states. He was the dog that could track a suspect through downtown Springfield after a 12-hour cold trail. He was the dog that had detected explosives in a package that would have killed 17 people at City Hall. He was the dog that had apprehended 43 dangerous criminals, never making a false positive, never failing when it mattered most. But more importantly, he was partner. Their bond had formed on Rex's first day at the police academy, when was assigned as his handler. From that moment forward, the two had been inseparable. They understood each other in the way that only partners who had faced life-and-death situations together could understand. Knew that Rex's left ear twitched when he detected an emotion couldn't read in a suspect's body language. Rex knew that his breathing changed when danger was approaching, even if his conscious mind hadn't registered the threat yet. They were two halves of a whole, operating with an almost telepathic synchronization that amazed other officers and occasionally unsettled the criminals they pursued. 3 years ago, at age 11, considered elderly for a K-9, Rex had been retired from active duty. His joints had begun to show signs of arthritis and had insisted on retirement rather than risk his partner's health. The department had offered Rex a permanent home with his family, an honor usually reserved for the most exceptional K-9 units. Had immediately accepted. Rex deserved to spend his final years in comfort and peace, surrounded by the family that loved him. Susan had prepared a beautiful room for Rex in the household, a spacious area with orthopedic bedding, climate control, and windows overlooking the backyard. But Rex rarely used that room. Instead, he followed everywhere. To the kitchen for morning coffee, to the study where reviewed case files during his off hours, to the bedroom at night where he curled up on the floor beside side of the bed. Even in retirement, Rex couldn't imagine being anywhere his partner wasn't. Had changed after retirement, Susan had noticed. He seemed simultaneously more relaxed and more anxious. The physical demands of police work had left his body, but his mind remained tethered to the job. He'd spend hours staring out the window, his hand absently stroking Rex's fur, his eyes unfocused, as if seeing something only he could perceive. Sometimes he'd wake up at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, and he'd go downstairs where Rex would already be waiting, the dog seemingly sensing his distress before it manifested. "You always know what I need," would whisper to Rex during these nocturnal hours, scratching behind the dog's ears in the way that never failed to soothe them both. Rex would place his head on his lap, his eyes full of unconditional loyalty and concern, as if silently asking what burden his partner was carrying. In the weeks leading up to his death, Rex's behavior had become increasingly strange. The dog stopped wanting to go for his afternoon walks, something he'd always loved. He refused his favorite treats. He developed a habit of standing at the front window for hours at a time, his body tense, occasionally letting out low growls at sounds no one else could hear. Susan attributed it to aging, but deep down, she knew it was something more. Animals possessed an intuition that science couldn't quite explain, a sensitivity to the world that humans had largely lost. Rex was trying to tell them something. They just weren't listening. 3 days before the funeral, Susan had taken Rex to the veterinarian, concerned about his deteriorating appetite and withdrawn behavior. Dr. Hayes, the same veterinarian who had cared for Rex throughout his police career, performed a complete examination. She checked his heart, his lungs, his joints, ran blood work and scanned for tumors. Everything came back normal. "Rex is in remarkable health for his age," Dr. Hayes had said with a reassuring smile. "I'd say he's got several good years left in him. Sometimes dogs just go through phases. Maybe he's sensing your grief about. They're more empathetic than we give them credit for." Susan had left the office feeling slightly better, but the nagging worry remained, because she knew, without a shadow of doubt, that Dr. Hayes was partially correct. Rex was sensing her grief, but it wasn't just that. In those final days before the funeral, Rex seemed to be mourning a specific person, displaying a depth of sorrow that transcended normal pet behavior. The morning of the funeral, Susan dressed carefully in a black dress she'd worn only once before, to her mother's funeral 20 years ago. She moved through the house in a fog, still unable to fully comprehend that wasn't going to walk through the door, wasn't going to make his terrible coffee in the kitchen, wasn't going to laugh at the evening news. The numbness was both a blessing and a curse. It allowed her to function, but it prevented her from truly processing what had happened. At 7 o'clock that morning, Susan decided to bring Rex to the funeral. It felt wrong to leave him alone at home, and she sensed that Rex needed to say goodbye as much as she did. She found him in the backyard, sitting motionless under the oak tree where he and used to rest during their evening walks. His collar had a special harness that would allow him to be controlled at the funeral home, and Susan gently secured it around his neck. "Come on, boy," she said softly, her voice breaking. "Let's go say goodbye to your partner." Rex followed her to the car, but his movements were slow, deliberate, as if he understood the gravity of what was about to transpire. Throughout the drive to the funeral home, he remained completely silent, his head resting against the window, his dark eyes tracking the familiar streets of Springfield. They passed the police precinct where had worked for nearly 3 decades, and Rex's ears perked up momentarily before drooping again. When they arrived at Riverside Funeral Home, a sprawling Victorian mansion converted into a place of mourning, Susan took a moment to collect herself before getting out of the car. She opened the passenger door, and Rex stepped out slowly, deliberately. His nose was working, processing dozens of unfamiliar scents. The funeral home smelled of lilies, formaldehyde, and the indefinable odor of sorrow. Susan's hands were trembling as she led Rex through the entrance. The funeral director, a tall man named Bernard with an expression of professional sympathy, greeted them solemnly. "Mrs., we're honored to have Rex here." Officer spoke of his partner often. The words, meant to be comforting, only deepened Susan's pain. They entered the main viewing room where his casket stood at the front, closed, surrounded by flowers of every color: red roses, white lilies, yellow orchids. A photograph of him in his dress uniform stood on an easel beside the casket, his eyes looking directly into the camera with the steady gaze of a man who had faced the world without flinching. Susan's breath caught in her throat. Rex, however, had gone rigid. Every muscle in the dog's body tensed, his ears pinned backward against his skull, his nose flared, inhaling deeply, processing something that went beyond normal scent detection. Susan felt the leash tighten in her hand as Rex's body became coiled, like a spring compressed to its maximum tension. The dog's eyes locked onto that wooden casket with an intensity that was almost frightening. "Rex," Susan whispered, unsure what was happening. "It's okay, boy." But it wasn't okay. Rex knew something was profoundly, catastrophically wrong. Every instinct honed by years of police training, every intuitive sense a dog possessed, was screaming at him that answers lay inside that casket. That his partner, the only being he had ever truly belonged to, had secrets that needed to be exposed. And Rex, always loyal, always dedicated to his duty, was preparing to alert in the most dramatic way possible. The funeral service would begin in an hour. The mourners would arrive soon, and when they did, they would witness something that none of them would ever forget: a dog's desperate attempt to communicate from beyond the barrier of species and speech, a final message from a partner who had loved and trusted completely. The truth, Rex seemed to understand, could not stay buried, not in that casket, and not in the hearts of those who had loved a man who carried secrets that had cost him his life. The funeral service was scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock in the morning. By 9:30, mourners had already begun arriving at Riverside Funeral Home, their faces painted with expressions of grief and shock. Officers in dress uniform filled the viewing room, their badges polished to gleaming perfection, their bearing rigid with the formality that law enforcement demanded at such occasions. There were detectives Susan recognized from various assignments, sergeants who had worked under his command, younger officers whose careers had mentored and guided. Some came with their families. Children sat quietly in pews, sensing the weight of the moment even if they didn't fully understand death's permanence. Susan stood near the casket, receiving condolences with a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else. People reached out to touch her arm, to embrace her, to whisper platitudes that sounded hollow in the face of such finality. "He was a good man. He lived a full life. He's in a better place." Each phrase felt like a small wound, well-intentioned but ultimately inadequate in the face of losing 30 years of partnership. Rex remained at her side, still wearing his special harness. The dog's behavior had been unusual all morning. During the car ride to the funeral home, he'd pressed his nose against the window, his breathing rapid and shallow. When they'd arrived, he'd deliberately marked several spots with his urine, unusual behavior for a well-trained dog, especially one of Rex's caliber. Bernard, the funeral director, had discreetly cleaned the marks, understanding that grief manifested in unexpected ways, even in animals. Now, as the opening remarks began and the priest stepped forward to lead the service, Rex began to shift his weight from one front paw to the other. Susan felt it through the leash, a subtle tenseness, a coiled energy that suggested something was building. She placed a reassuring hand on his head. "It's okay, boy," she whispered. "Let's just get through this." The priest's voice filled the chapel, speaking of his virtues, his dedication, his legacy. Officer devoted his life to protecting others. He embodied the values we all aspire to: courage, integrity, loyalty. That word loyalty seemed to trigger something in Rex. The dog's entire body went rigid. His ears swiveled backward against his skull, his nose wrinkled, exposing his teeth slightly. Susan felt her heart rate increase. She recognized these signs from watching Rex work as a police dog. These were the physical manifestations of alert. Something had triggered his instincts. "What is it?" she whispered, but Rex didn't respond. Instead, his gaze locked onto the casket with laser-like focus. The priest continued his eulogy, unaware of the growing tension beside the front pew. More mourners filed past the casket, kneeling briefly in prayer or simply standing in silent tribute. The air felt heavy, thick with emotion and incense from the burning candles. 30 seconds later, Rex began to whine. It was a high-pitched sound, completely unlike his normal vocalizations. The whine escalated to a soft growl, not aggressive but urgent. Susan squeezed the leash, her palms beginning to sweat. "Rex, no," she commanded quietly, drawing a few curious glances from nearby mourners. "Quiet." But Rex wasn't listening. His body was trembling now, every muscle vibrating with contained urgency. He pulled forward against the leash with surprising strength for a dog of his age. Susan dug in her heels, trying to hold him in place, but she could feel him slipping from her control, something that rarely happened with a well-trained K9. The whine transformed into something more. It became a bark, short, sharp, and achingly desperate. Several mourners turned in their seats. An elderly woman in the third pew flinched. The priest paused in his eulogy, glancing toward the disturbance. "Rex, stop it," Susan hissed, her face flushing crimson with embarrassment. She was the widow of a decorated police officer. She was supposed to be composed, dignified, in control. Instead, she was wrestling with a dog who seemed to be losing his mind. But Rex couldn't stop. It was as if something had possessed him, some primal instinct that overrode all training, all discipline, all obedience. Another bark, louder this time, then another, and another. Each bark seemed to come from a place deep within the dog's soul, a place that transcended reason and responded to something only Rex could perceive. "Mrs., perhaps we should move the dog to another room," Bernard suggested tactfully, appearing at Susan's elbow with the practiced sympathy of a professional funeral director who had managed countless disruptions. Susan nodded. "Yes, I'm so sorry, But Rex had other ideas. With a sudden, powerful lunge, he broke free from Susan's grip. The leash, suddenly slack, fell to the floor. The dog bolted forward toward the casket, his barks now a continuous, urgent stream of sound that echoed off the chapel walls. His nails scraped against the polished wooden floor. His body was quivering with an intensity that seemed to defy his age. "Rex!" Susan cried out, rushing after him, but Bernard was quicker. The funeral director grabbed the loose end of the leash, trying to restrain the dog, but Rex was possessed by something beyond normal behavior. The barking intensified, becoming almost primal, echoing through the funeral home like an alarm bell no one could silence. "What in God's name?" Father Mitchell muttered, abandoning his position at the pulpit. Officers stood up from their pews, confusion and concern etched across their faces. One younger cop, Officer Williams, moved forward to help restrain Rex, but the dog's focus never wavered from the casket. It was as if Rex could see through the wood, as if he could perceive something hidden inside that commanded all his attention. At that moment, Detective Frank stood up from where he'd been sitting in the second pew. His weathered face had gone pale. He stared at Rex with an intensity that matched the dog's, his eyes narrowing as he watched the animal's desperate, frantic barks. Frank had worked with Rex on dozens of cases. He knew this dog's behavior, understood his training, recognized the subtle nuances of his communication. And Frank knew, with absolute certainty, that Rex wasn't having a nervous breakdown or suffering from grief-induced confusion. Rex was alerting. The dog was doing what he'd been trained to do for years as a K-9 unit. He was communicating that he had found something significant. The target of his alert was the casket. Frank's mind began to race, connecting dots that he'd been too distracted by grief to see before. The strange reassignment had mentioned months ago, the worried expression that had become permanent on his partner's face, the late nights at the precinct, the cryptic phone calls, and now this, a retired police dog barking frantically at a casket with an intensity that suggested he was trying to communicate something of life-or-death importance. "Quiet, quiet," Bernard was saying, but Rex paid no attention. The barks continued, desperate and urgent, growing hoarse from the intensity of his effort. Susan had tears streaming down her face, torn between her embarrassment and a growing sense that something was terribly wrong. She moved toward Rex, trying to comfort him, but the dog's focus remained absolute. "Maybe the dog's sick," someone whispered in the congregation. "It's the stress," another voice suggested. "Dogs grieve too." But Frank knew better. He stood frozen, his hand gripping the back of the pew, his mind working through the implications of what he was witnessing. In his 35 years of law enforcement experience, Frank had learned to trust instinct. And his instinct was screaming at him now that Rex's behavior was no accident. It was a message, a desperate, urgent message from a dog who had spent 8 years as a police officer and understood the importance of alerting to significant evidence. The question that now consumed Frank's mind was simple: what had hidden in that casket? And more importantly, why Frank couldn't sleep. He sat in his home office at 2 in the morning, the room illuminated only by the pale glow of his desk lamp and the multiple computer screens displaying case files. Coffee had gone cold in the mug beside his keyboard hours ago. His wife had long since retreated upstairs, exasperated by his obsession. "It's not healthy," she'd said gently. "You need to let it go." But Frank couldn't let it go. Because something that had occurred at its funeral, that inexplicable, desperate barking from a dog who had always been perfectly trained, had awakened something in Frank's detective's mind. A nagging sense that something was catastrophically wrong. He'd been reviewing case files for the past 8 hours. The digital records spread across his screens like a puzzle with missing pieces. Frank had worked alongside for 35 years, had partnered with him on hundreds of cases, had learned investigative techniques from watching the way his mind worked, had been methodical, careful, meticulous in his documentation, everything by the book, everything accounted for. Except for the inconsistencies. Frank had first noticed them 3 months ago during a casual conversation within the precinct break room, had mentioned being reassigned to desk duty for administrative restructuring purposes, a phrase that struck Frank as oddly formal for a promotion that was supposed to be temporary. At the time, Frank had thought nothing of it. Administrative shuffles happened all the time. But now, looking back through the records, Frank could see a pattern emerging. 3 months ago had been leading active investigations into several major drug trafficking operations. The cases were progressing well, had documented solid evidence, interviewed key witnesses, was building ironclad prosecutions. Then, suddenly, everything stopped, was reassigned. The cases were distributed among other detectives, and when Frank dug deeper into what happened to those cases after reassignment, he found something troubling. Evidence had gone missing. Specifically, evidence from 3 separate investigations, all cases that had been personally overseeing. The documentation existed, meticulously logged by himself, but physical evidence from 2 major drug busts had disappeared from the evidence locker. Not lost, not misfiled, disappeared. The chain of custody records showed the evidence had been logged in by, but the sign-out sheets had been altered. Multiple entries had been whited out and rewritten in different handwriting. Frank pulled up the security footage from the evidence locker. The digital records showed activity from nights when the precinct was supposedly empty. 3 individuals accessing the evidence locker using override codes. Frank recognized 2 of the faces immediately, Captain James and Lieutenant Robert Hayes. They were 2 of superiors, men with exemplary records and unquestionable authority to access evidence for legitimate purposes. But something about the timing seemed wrong. The evidence accesses had all occurred during the period when was supposedly being restructured into desk duty. And when Frank cross-referenced the missing evidence with street arrests that had occurred in the weeks following the evidence disappearances, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The same drugs that had been seized in investigations were showing up on the streets again. Large quantities, high purity, being distributed through the exact networks had been investigating. Frank's hands trembled as he pulled up his personal email account, something that was technically against policy, but Frank had a key to his locked desk drawer where his password was written on a sticky note. Had never been particularly tech-savvy. He preferred writing things down the old-fashioned way. Inside his email, Frank found drafts of messages that were never sent. Messages to Internal Affairs, to the FBI field office, to the state attorney general. Each draft carefully detailed the evidence he'd discovered, the inconsistencies he'd found, the people he suspected of involvement. The emails had been saved but never transmitted, had documented everything but had never actually reported it. Why? Frank found the answer in his notes, scrawled on a piece of paper tucked into the file folder. Frank recognized his handwriting immediately, precise, careful, deliberate. Afraid, don't know who to trust. Evidence suggests corruption reaches higher. Someone warned me, someone inside. Death threats implied but not explicit. Can't protect Susan and the kids if I come forward. Need to find a way to secure evidence. Need insurance. Need proof of what they're capable of. The note was dated 2 months before his death. Frank's chest constricted. He read the note again, then a third time, his brain struggling to process the implications. Had discovered corruption, serious corruption, and he had been threatened. The question that now consumed Frank was whether sudden death had been natural or whether it had been orchestrated by the very people he was investigating. The door to Frank's office opened and appeared in her nightgown, her face etched with concern. "Frank, you need to come to bed. This isn't healthy." "Look at this," Frank said, his voice hollow. He showed her the security footage, the missing evidence records, his handwritten notes. Her face went pale as she understood what she was looking at. "My God," she whispered, "do you think they killed him?" Frank didn't answer immediately. He didn't have evidence of murder, only evidence of corruption and threats. But a retired K-9's desperate barking at a casket suggested that something was very wrong, and Frank's 35 years of detective work had taught him to trust his instincts. "I don't know," Frank finally said, "but I need to find out." The next morning, Frank sat in his car outside the coffee shop where he'd arranged to meet Susan. He'd called her at 7 a.m. before she'd had time to make funeral arrangements or contact relatives. "I need to talk to you about," he'd said without preamble. "Something isn't right. It's important." Susan looked devastated when she arrived. She'd aged a decade in the past 48 hours, her eyes hollow, her movements sluggish with grief. Frank embraced her briefly, then guided her to a quiet corner table. He ordered her coffee, black, the way he had always drunk it, and began to carefully, methodically lay out what he'd discovered. He showed her the email drafts on his tablet. He explained the missing evidence, the security footage, the altered chain of custody records. He told her about his mysterious reassignment and the subsequent disappearance of his cases. He recounted the conversation he'd had with weeks ago when his partner had seemed paranoid and frightened. And he asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the funeral. Did ever tell you he was investigating corruption? Susan's hands began to shake. No, but there were nights he couldn't sleep. He'd go into his study and I'd find him at 3 in the morning staring at files, looking terrified. He told me it was nothing. He said I didn't need to worry, but he was afraid, Frank, I could feel it. He was afraid of something. Did he ever mention names? Hayes, Turner. Susan's eyes widened. The sergeant, David Turner, he came to the house about a month ago, seemed uncomfortable. After Turner left, told me to take the kids to my mother's house for the weekend. He said he needed some time alone. When I asked why, he just said. He said some things might happen that I needed to be protected from. Frank leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. 3 names. Captain, Lieutenant Hayes, and Sergeant David Turner. All of them with access to evidence. All of them with authority to move freely through the precinct. All of them positioned strategically throughout the department where they could control information and manipulate investigations. I need to tell you something, Frank said quietly, and I need you to listen very carefully. I don't think he had a natural heart attack. I think he was poisoned or silenced in some way. And I think it was done because he knew too much about what Hayes and Turner have been doing. Susan's face went white. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning pale. What do we do? She whispered. We need evidence, Frank said. Real evidence. Solid evidence that will hold up in court and with the feds. And Susan, I think, may have already secured that evidence. He was too smart not to, and I think Rex knew about it. That's why he was barking at the casket. Susan's eyes widened in understanding. Did you think he put something in the casket before he died? Frank nodded slowly. I think was a cop first and always. Even when he was dying, even in his final moments, he was thinking about the job, about justice, about making sure the truth came out. I think he may have hidden evidence somewhere no one would think to look, somewhere safe. Somewhere a dying man could ensure would be found eventually. Inside the casket, Susan said, her voice barely audible. Inside the casket, Frank confirmed. The two sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of what they were contemplating settling over them like a heavy blanket. They were about to enter dangerous territory. They were about to accuse 3 high-ranking police officers of corruption and possibly murder. They would need to be careful. They would need to be absolutely certain. But Frank knew, with the certainty that only a lifetime in law enforcement could provide, that they were on the precipice of uncovering something that would shake the foundation of the Springfield Police Department to its core. We need to exhume the casket, Frank finally said. We need to see what left for us. Office of Federal Bureau of Investigation Special Agent was located in a nondescript federal building downtown, unremarkable except for the security measures that seemed standard for any government facility. Frank had contacted her through an old connection from his days working on joint task forces, and she'd agreed to meet with him on short notice, though the skeptical expression on her face suggested she wasn't expecting much from a retired detective with a theory based on a dog's behavior at a funeral. Frank laid out everything methodically. The missing evidence, the security footage, the altered chain of custody records, unsent emails, the cryptic notes. Susan sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while Special Agent listened without interrupting, her dark eyes processing every detail. This is a serious accusation, finally said, her accent carrying the faint musical lilt of her Mexican-American heritage. You're suggesting that 3 decorated law enforcement officers are running a drug trafficking operation, and that one of them may have murdered officer to cover it up. I'm saying it's worth investigating, Frank replied carefully. I'm saying the evidence suggests foul play, and I'm saying that officer's dog, a retired K-9 with 8 years of police training, was desperately trying to communicate something at the funeral. I'm saying that left evidence hidden in his casket, and I'm saying that if we don't move quickly and carefully, that evidence will disappear the same way the drug evidence did. Leaned back in her chair, considering. Even if everything you're saying is true, we can't exhume a casket based on the barking of a dog. We need probable cause. We need legal authority. And frankly, we need to know exactly what we're looking for. Then let me tell you why I'm certain hid something, Susan said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. Her voice was steady now, strengthened by grief and purpose. Was a meticulous man. Everything had its place. Everything was documented and organized. 3 weeks before he died, I found him rewriting his will. He said it was just routine, that everyone should update their wills periodically. But there was something desperate about the way he did it. He made me promise I wouldn't open any sealed documents he left unless something happened to him. Unless something happened to him. His eyebrows rose slightly. Did he leave you sealed documents? He did, Susan confirmed. 3 sealed envelopes. They're in a safe deposit box at our bank. He said that if anything ever happened to him, I should open them and show them to someone I trusted. I thought they were just legal documents, a second will or insurance information, but now I understand. He was leaving me a trail to follow, a way to find the truth. Frank and exchanged glances. We need to see those envelopes, said. 2 hours later, in a private room at Springfield National Bank, Susan opened the safe deposit box with trembling hands. Inside, among insurance documents and property deeds, lay 3 sealed envelopes, each labeled with dates and her name written in careful script. The first envelope contained what appeared to be financial records, bank statements showing suspicious transfers to shell companies. The second held photographs of meetings between Hayes and Turner in what appeared to be a warehouse, accompanied by individuals known to be connected to organized crime. The third contained a handwritten ledger detailing dates, amounts, and descriptions of inventory coded reference to the missing evidence. But perhaps most damning was a letter, written in his own hand, addressed to Susan and dated just 2 weeks before his death. My dearest Susan, if you're reading this, then my fears have come to pass. I have discovered something that I can no longer ignore, corruption so deep and so dangerous that I can no longer remain silent. But remaining silent is no longer an option for me anyway, because I believe they know that I know. I have been warned, not directly, but the message is clear. My life is in danger. I cannot go to our department with this information because I don't know who else might be involved. I can't take it to the local authorities for the same reason. I cannot risk my family's safety by making this public, while the people involved still have power and influence. So I am doing what any good police officer does. I am securing the evidence. I am documenting everything. And I am leaving this trail for you and whoever you trust to follow after I am gone. If something happens to me, if I die suddenly, if the doctors cannot explain why, if my death seems convenient, please know that it was not an accident. Please know that I knew too much. I have hidden additional evidence in a place that no one would think to disturb. I have entrusted my partner, Rex, with helping to reveal it. He is trained to alert on significant discoveries, and he will know when you are close to the truth. I love you more than anything in this world. I'm sorry I have brought this into our lives, but I would not be the man you married if I looked away from corruption and injustice, even when facing it might cost me everything. Be strong, be careful, and please find the truth. All my love. Susan wept as she read the letter aloud, listened intently, her mind already working through the legal implications. Frank placed a reassuring hand on Susan's shoulder, his own eyes glistening. This is enough for a warrant, said finally. Combined with the financial records and photographs, we have probable cause to suspect that Hayes and Turner have been involved in organized criminal activity. But we still need to establish whether his death was natural or induced. For that, we'll need to exhume the body and conduct a full autopsy. What about the evidence in the casket? Frank asked. The thing that Rex was alerting on. That's where it gets tricky, replied. If hid evidence in his own casket before his death, it's still his property, or now his estate's property. We can petition the court for an exhumation order. Susan, as his widow, has standing to request this. Will need to present these documents to a judge. The process took 3 days. 3 days of careful legal maneuvering, of working with federal prosecutors, of Susan answering questions and providing testimony about her husband's state of mind and his concerns. 3 days during which Frank had to be extraordinarily careful not to tip off Hayes or Turner that an investigation was. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, with rain beginning to fall from the sky, an exhumation order was signed by Judge. The casket would be opened the next morning at the Springfield County Medical Examiner's office. That night Frank received a phone call at home. The number was blocked. The voice on the other end was muffled, disguised, but unmistakably threatening. "Stop asking questions about officer. Stop talking to federal agents. Some things are better left buried, for everyone's sake." The line went dead. Frank's hands trembled as he replayed the message. They knew. Somehow, despite all their precautions, Hayes and Turner knew what was coming. The exhumation scheduled for the next morning had become a race against time. Either they would find hidden evidence and secure it with federal protection, or the corrupt officers would find a way to intercept it, destroy it, and ensure that their crimes remained hidden. That evening Frank sat watching the rain fall against their windows. "It's becoming real now," said quietly. "You understand that?" "I know," Frank replied. "And I understand that we might be in danger, but understood that too, and he chose to pursue justice anyway. I can't do less than my partner." At 7 a.m. the next morning, as dawn broke gray and reluctant over Springfield, Frank, Susan, and the county medical examiner, Dr. Charles Wheeler, stood in the basement of the medical examiner's office. The casket, sealed for 4 days, sat on a steel examination table under harsh fluorescent lights. "Everyone ready?" Dr. Wheeler asked, his gloved hands positioned over the casket's lock. No one was truly ready. No one knew what they were about to uncover or what it would mean, but they had come too far to turn back now. Frank nodded. Dr. Wheeler's hands moved with professional efficiency. The casket opened with a soft hiss of escaping air, the sound of 4 days of sealed burial releasing into the sterile environment of a morgue. Inside lay at rest, his body dressed in the suit he'd been buried in. But beneath his hands, carefully concealed in the casket lining where only someone who had carefully planned this moment before death could place it, was a small waterproof box. Dr. Wheeler removed it carefully, using sterile instruments. He opened the box with trembling hands, and everyone leaned forward, holding their breath, waiting to see what truth had managed to protect beyond the grave. Inside were documents, recordings, and photographs. Everything had gathered. Everything needed to bring the corrupt officers to justice. Everything had died trying to protect. As they spread the evidence across the examination table, Rex, who had been brought by Susan, suddenly let out a single, mournful howl. It was a sound of release, of completion, of a partner finally understanding that his last mission had been accomplished. His final message had been delivered. The contents of his hidden box were extraordinary. Dr. Charles Wheeler, the county medical examiner, worked with federal forensic specialists to catalog and analyze the materials. What emerged was a meticulous record of criminal conspiracy spanning over 3 years. The digital recordings were particularly damning, had managed to covertly record conversations between Hayes and Turner discussing their operation with startling frankness and incriminating detail. "We've got them," said confidently, reviewing the materials in a secure federal conference room. "Multiple counts of drug trafficking, money laundering, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. This is a slam-dunk prosecution." But there was one detail that remained unresolved: the exact cause of his death. He had officially died of a heart attack, but given the circumstances, insisted on a full toxicology screen. Dr. Wheeler conducted an extensive autopsy, examining organs, blood, and tissue samples with meticulous precision. The results came back 3 days later, and they were shocking. Had been poisoned. Specifically, he had ingested a synthetic compound designed to mimic the effects of a massive coronary event. The poison, a rare pharmaceutical derivative that had been developed for clandestine use by intelligence agencies, would leave minimal traces in the body after a few days. It was the kind of poison that only someone with deep connections to sophisticated criminal networks would know about or have access to. "They murdered him," Susan said flatly when informed her of the results. She stood in the federal office, her hands gripping the edge of a desk, her knuckles white with tension. "They poisoned my husband." Nodded solemnly. "That's what the evidence indicates, and now we have proof that will stand up in court. Dr. Wheeler has prepared a detailed toxicology report. The poison was injected into his system approximately 6 hours before his death. Someone had to have had direct access to him." Frank leaned forward. "The coffee. Always drank coffee in the precinct break room before leaving for the day. Someone poisoned his coffee." Within 48 hours, federal agents arrested Captain James at his home, took Lieutenant Robert Hayes into custody at his office, and brought Sergeant David Turner in for questioning. The arrests sent shockwaves through the Springfield Police Department. Officers who had served under these men, who had respected them, who had trusted them with their lives, were forced to confront the horrifying reality that corruption had festered at the highest levels of their agency. The investigation that followed was exhaustive and methodical. Federal prosecutors, working in coordination with state authorities, began unraveling the complete scope of the conspiracy. What emerged was a criminal enterprise far more sophisticated and profitable than anyone had initially realized. Over 3 years, the conspiracy had generated over $47 million in illegal profits. The scheme had begun when Captain had established connections with a major drug trafficking organization operating out of the Midwest. Using his position as a captain in the narcotics division, had access to information about upcoming drug busts. He had shared that information with Turner and Hayes, who would then intercept shipments before they reached arrest sites, repackage the drugs, and distribute them through their own network. The evidence seized in recordings included conversations where the 3 officers discussed specific operations, which dealers to protect, which operations to shut down to maintain appearances, and which shipments to intercept. They had been exceptionally calculating, careful to maintain a facade of legitimacy while systematically stealing evidence from crime scenes. The financial trail was equally incriminating. Money from the sale of stolen drugs had been funneled through shell companies registered in various names, then laundered through legitimate businesses including restaurants, nightclubs, and a construction company. Owned a luxury vacation home in Colorado that he'd somehow acquired on a police captain's salary. Hayes had invested in commercial real estate worth several $1,000,000. Turner had been preparing to retire with a mysteriously substantial nest egg. But the most damaging piece of evidence was perhaps the ledger that had maintained. It documented every transaction, every amount, every date. It matched perfectly with the recorded conversations, the bank records, and the testimony of informants who came forward once they realized the scope of the federal investigation. The trial began 2 months after the arrests. United States v. James, Robert Hayes, and David Turner became a media sensation. News trucks camped outside the federal courthouse. The trial stretched across 6 weeks, with testimony from forensic accountants, DEA agents, FBI specialists, and dozens of witnesses. Recordings were played in court, his voice emanating from speakers as the jury heard him calmly identifying the corruption, documenting the crimes, building an unassailable case against his colleagues even as they were plotting his death. Hearing's voice, measured, professional, had a profound impact on the jury. Here was a man who had known his life was in danger, who had known he was running out of time, and who had spent his final weeks of life not hiding or fleeing, but carefully, methodically building a case to bring criminals to justice. Dr. Wheeler about the toxicology findings. The poison was presented to the jury. Expert witnesses explained how it mimicked cardiac symptoms, how detection would be nearly impossible without a specific autopsy protocol, how only sophisticated criminal organizations would have access to such compounds. The defense attempted to argue reasonable doubt, to suggest that death had indeed been natural, that the poison evidence was circumstantial. But the jury wasn't convinced. The preponderance of evidence was overwhelming. The recordings were irrefutable. The financial records didn't lie. On a gray Thursday afternoon in November, 1 year after his death, the jury returned with verdicts. Guilty, guilty, guilty. All 3 counts for each defendant: drug trafficking, money laundering, evidence tampering, conspiracy, and murder. The gallery erupted. Susan, sitting in the front row with Frank and her adult children, wept openly. Around her, officers from the Springfield Police Department stood and applauded, a rare occurrence in a courtroom, but one that reflected the profound sense of justice that had finally been served. When asked to speak before sentencing, Susan stood and addressed the court directly. "My husband was a good man. He was a dedicated police officer who believed in the law and in justice. When he discovered corruption, he didn't look the other way. He didn't rationalize it. He didn't become complicit. He did what was right, even when it terrified him. And he paid the ultimate price for that integrity." She looked directly at Hayes and Turner, who sat in their chairs, faces carefully neutral. "You murdered a good man. You stole $47 million from your community. You violated every oath you took as police officers. But you failed in one crucial way. You failed to silence the truth. Speaks to you now from beyond the grave, through the evidence he so carefully preserved. And that evidence will ensure that you spend the rest of your lives in prison, where you belong." The sentencing was swift and severe. Received 35 years. Hayes received 32 years. Turner received 28 years. Additional charges would be filed related to the organized crime connections, likely adding decades to their sentences. As the convicted officers were led away in shackles, Frank placed a hand on Susan's shoulder. "He did it," Frank said quietly. "One." Susan looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. Not the way he wanted to win, not the way any of us wanted this to end, but yes, he won. That evening, as the story dominated local and national news, a reporter asked federal prosecutors about its role in bringing down the conspiracy. The prosecutor, a veteran named No Relation To, addressed the cameras with characteristic professionalism. "Officer conducted an investigation that most people in his position would have been too frightened to undertake. He knew his life was in danger. He knew that coming forward could result in his death. But he gathered evidence anyway, documented the crimes carefully, and made arrangements to ensure that truth would survive him. In law enforcement, we say that integrity is our most valuable commodity. Officer that principle, even unto death. The Springfield Police Department and the entire legal system owe him an immeasurable debt." That night, as a cold November wind swept through Springfield, Susan stood in her backyard with Rex. The dog had aged visibly in the year since death. His muzzle was grayer, his movements slower. But as he stood beside Susan, looking out at the darkness, there was a sense of peace about him. His final alert had been heard. His partner's death had been avenged. Justice had been served. And though the road had been long and painful, his final mission as a police officer was complete. 6 months after the sentencing of Hayes and Turner, Susan stood in a modest office space in downtown Springfield, surrounded by boxes of documents, legal files, and framed photographs of her late husband. The Foundation for Police Integrity had officially been established 1 month prior, with Susan as its founding director. The organization's mission was simple but profound: to provide legal support, financial protection, and institutional advocacy for law enforcement officers who came forward to expose corruption within their agencies. The foundation had grown remarkably fast. News of story had spread throughout the country, covered by major news outlets, featured in documentaries, and discussed in law enforcement academies across the nation. Officers from police departments in dozens of states had reached out to Susan, sharing their own stories of witnessing corruption, of being pressured to remain silent, of fearing for their lives and their families' safety if they spoke up. Each story reinforced what had known, were frequently isolated, often ostracized by their departments, and in some cases, faced serious physical danger. Susan had used the speaking fees from her appearances on news programs, documentaries, and law enforcement conferences to seed the foundation's initial funding. But the real boost had come from an unexpected source. The federal prosecutor who had led the case against Hayes and Turner had written a best-selling book about the investigation titled The Dog's Truth: How One Officer's Courage Exposed Police Corruption. The book's royalties, substantial due to its surprising commercial success, had been donated entirely to the foundation in its name. Now the foundation had a staff of 5, including a dedicated attorney, 2 victim advocates, a forensic accountant, and an administrative assistant. They had already provided legal support to 14 police officers who had come forward to report corruption, had helped 3 of them secure safe housing after receiving threats, and had coordinated with the FBI on 4 separate investigations into departmental wrongdoing. "We're making a difference," Susan said to Frank during one of his frequent visits to the foundation's office. Frank had become an unofficial advisor to the organization, lending his 3 decades of law enforcement experience to help navigate the complex world of police accountability. "But I wish it didn't take death to get here. I wish more departments would listen to without needing federal intervention." Frank nodded. "Change is slow, but it's happening. The Springfield Police Department has completely overhauled its internal affairs division. Other departments are calling asking for advice on how to create better protections. What you're doing now, it's creating a ripple effect." The foundation wasn't the only legacy emerging from the case. Universities and law schools across the country had begun incorporating story into their curriculum. Criminal justice programs now taught about the case as an example of ethical conduct in law enforcement. Police academies used recordings as training materials, demonstrating to recruits what it meant to stand by your principles even when facing existential threats. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy came in the form of legislative change. Senator Williams, who represented state, had introduced the Protection Act in Congress. The legislation, named after, provided federal funding for protection programs in police departments nationwide, established standardized protocols for investigating corruption allegations, and created legal protections for officers who reported wrongdoing in good faith. The bill had passed with surprising bipartisan support, a rarity in the polarized modern political landscape, and had been signed into law by the president himself. At the signing ceremony in Washington, Susan had been invited to stand beside the president as he signed the legislation. Cameras flashed. Senators applauded. But Susan's mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the cost of his integrity, about how it had taken his death to inspire the changes that should have been implemented years ago. Meanwhile, Rex was experiencing his own form of legacy. The retired K-9 had been invited by Police Commissioner Torres to become the Springfield Police Academy's unofficial mascot and comfort animal. Rex now spent 4 days a week at the academy, where he was introduced to each new class of recruits with the story of his partnership with, and his remarkable behavior at the funeral. The Police Academy's Director of Training, Captain Sarah Mitchell, had incorporated Rex into her curriculum in an unexpected way. During the segment on police ethics and integrity, recruits would spend an hour in a room with Rex, and Captain Mitchell would tell them the story of a man who had faced corruption, who had known his life was in danger, and who had chosen to do what was right anyway. Then she would tell them about Rex's alert at the funeral, his desperate attempt to communicate what his partner had tried to protect. This dog, Captain Mitchell would tell the trainees, understood something that took the rest of us too long to learn, that integrity matters more than loyalty to a corrupt system, that doing the right thing is more important than personal safety, that a good officer serves justice, not power. Rex would sit calmly through the story, his graying muzzle occasionally tilting towards students who approached him to offer gentle touches. The impact on recruits was profound. First-year Officer Daniel, who would go on to win commendations for his integrity in refusing to overlook misconduct by a superior officer, later attributed his decision to stand up to Rex's presence during his training. When I saw that dog, when I heard about what it did for its partner, I realized that integrity isn't optional, had written in a letter to Susan. It's who we are as officers. That dog reminded me of that when I needed it most. The national conversation about police accountability that had emerged from this case was equally significant. Think tanks and policy organizations released comprehensive reports on corruption within law enforcement. Criminal justice reform advocates cited its case as evidence that meaningful change required both individual courage and systemic reform. Media outlets that had previously treated police corruption as an isolated problem began investigating patterns of wrongdoing across multiple departments nationwide. In October, a year and a half after his death, Susan received an invitation to speak at the International Association of Chiefs of Police annual conference. She spent 20 minutes on stage, addressing 500 police leaders from across the world, sharing her husband's story and the lessons it contained. My husband wasn't looking to be a hero, Susan told the assembled chiefs. He was simply a man doing his job, trying to protect his community, when he discovered that corruption was undermining everything he had sworn to uphold. He faced a terrible choice. He could have remained silent, protected himself and his family, lived out his career without incident. But that wasn't who was. He believed that police officers had a special responsibility, a duty to uphold not just the law, but the principles the law represented. She paused, looking out at the faces before her. I'm not going to pretend this ended the way I wanted. My husband is gone. My children lost their father. I lost my partner of 30 years. But from that tragedy, something important has emerged. We have created structures and protections so that other officers who come forward won't have to pay the price paid. We have begun a national conversation about what it means to be a police officer with integrity. And we have shown that one person's courage, even in the face of death, can create waves of change that ripple across an entire profession. The ovation lasted for nearly 3 minutes. After the speech, Susan visited the exhibition hall where various police-related organizations had booths. One booth displayed materials from the newly established National Police Integrity Foundation, an organization that had grown out of the publicity surrounding this case. The foundation worked with police departments nationwide to implement best practices for handling corruption allegations and protecting. As Susan walked through the conference, officer after officer approached her to share their own stories, of witnessing wrongdoing, of staying silent out of fear, of watching the system fail to address problems. Their stories reinforced the crucial importance of the foundation's work, and Susan committed to expanding its reach and funding. That evening, back in Springfield, Susan sat in her backyard with Rex. The dog was now 13 years old, visibly aging but still alert and present. She watched him gaze out at the darkness, his ears occasionally perking up at distant sounds. "We did it, boy," she whispered, stroking his graying head. "We honored him. We made sure his story meant something." Rex leaned against her leg, his head tilting to rest against her knee. In that simple gesture was a profound truth, that the bond between them extended beyond death, that his legacy lived in their continued work, and that his sacrifice had created meaning that would outlast them all. The year had brought closure to Susan and Rex, but it had also brought something larger, the promise that police officers who chose integrity over convenience would no longer stand alone. Courage had fundamentally altered the landscape of law enforcement accountability, creating pathways for and establishing consequences for corruption. In the end, that was perhaps his greatest victory. 2 years after his death, on a cool spring morning in Springfield, a bronze statue was unveiled in front of the Springfield Police Academy. The sculpture depicted two figures, a man and a dog, standing together, their postures mirroring each other in a way that suggested profound partnership and unwavering loyalty. The man's hand rested on the dog's head, and his face bore an expression of gentle determination. The dog's eyes were fixed forward, alert and dedicated, as if perpetually awaiting the next command. The inscription on the base read, "Officer and K9 Officer Rex, integrity never dies." Their sacrifice reminds us that true courage means standing for what is right, even when the cost is everything. Nearly 2,000 people had gathered for the dedication ceremony. Police officers in dress uniforms stood in solemn rows. Academy trainees formed an honor guard. City officials and federal law enforcement representatives were present. But the most poignant moment came when Susan walked forward to place her hand on the statue's bronze leg, a gesture that mirrored the way she had petted Rex countless times over the past 2 years. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "Thank you for remembering him. Thank you for honoring what he gave." As she spoke those words, officers throughout the crowd removed their caps in a gesture of respect. Many wept openly. The statue had become a pilgrimage site for officers nationwide, people who came to stand before it and contemplate what integrity really meant, what sacrifice entailed, what it meant to be willing to lose everything for a principle. The foundation bearing its name had grown exponentially. What had begun as a small office with 5 staff members had expanded into a national organization with regional chapters in 12 states. The foundation now provided comprehensive support to police officers and their families who came forward to report corruption. They had successfully advocated for legislation in 7 states and had coordinated federal investigations into corruption in 12 separate police departments. But beyond the institutional accomplishments, the foundation's real impact could be measured in individual lives transformed. Officers like Michael Torres, a detective in Los Angeles who had reported systematic corruption in his narcotics division and had received death threats, had received legal representation and protective relocation through the foundation. His courage had led to the conviction of 8 officers and the dismantling of a cocaine trafficking operation operating within his department. Another officer, Jessica from Seattle, had reported sexual harassment and abuse of power by her commanding officer. The foundation had provided her with legal support through a wrongful termination suit that she ultimately won, setting a precedent for addressing officer misconduct. The publicity from her case had inspired 15 other officers in her department to come forward with their own allegations. These stories and dozens like them were documented in the foundation's comprehensive annual reports. Each one represented a person who had chosen integrity over self-preservation, who had been willing to face professional consequences and personal danger to expose wrongdoing. The foundation ensured they were not forgotten, not abandoned, not left to suffer alone for doing what was right. But the most significant memorial came in the form of legislative achievement. The Protection Act, which had been signed into federal law 18 months earlier, had already been implemented in police departments across the country. The legislation established concrete protections for, including mandatory review of all corruption allegations by independent bodies, financial compensation for officers who lost their positions due to, and provisions protecting officers and their families from retaliation. Equally important was the standard, an unofficial but widely adopted set of best practices for police integrity that had been developed by the Foundation in collaboration with police leadership organizations. The standard called for transparent promotion processes, regular ethics training, clear procedures, and institutional cultures that valued integrity over loyalty to corrupt systems. A comprehensive study conducted by a prominent criminology research institute found that departments implementing the standard had experienced a statistically significant reduction in corruption allegations and a corresponding increase in internal reporting of misconduct, suggesting that when officers felt safe coming forward, they would do so, and when departments addressed corruption seriously, it decreased overall. Academic institutions had also responded to this legacy. 43 law schools and criminal justice programs nationwide had established scholarships or fellowships in his name, available to students studying criminal justice ethics or police accountability. Universities had created internship programs where students could work with the Foundation, gaining practical experience in fields related to law enforcement reform. But amidst all the institutional accomplishments, the most poignant aspect of his legacy remained personal. Rex, now 14 years old, had become a living symbol of the bond between an officer and his duty. The retired K-9 spent his final years as the police academy's most important asset, not for enforcement purposes, but for teaching. Students would spend time with Rex, hearing his story, understanding that integrity transcended species and protocol. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the Academy's director of training, had documented Rex's impact in essays and interviews. Young officers who meet Rex understand something fundamental, she had written. They understand that police work is ultimately about relationships, between officers and their communities, between partners, and between people and principles. Rex embodied all of that. He was loyal to, but his loyalty extended beyond personal attachment to include loyalty to truth, to justice, to what was right. That's what we're trying to instill in our recruits, that kind of principled loyalty. In March of his 14th year, Rex began to decline. His arthritis became more pronounced. His appetite diminished. His breathing became labored. Susan, recognizing the signs, made the difficult decision to increase his comfort care. She spent his final days with him, along with Frank and the officers who had come to love this remarkable dog. On a cool morning in April, with spring rain falling outside the windows, Rex passed away peacefully. His death was marked with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for fallen officers. His casket, a small one, crafted specifically for the occasion, was carried by 6 police officers, with Frank walking at the front. Over 500 people attended his funeral at the Springfield Police Academy. Police Commissioner Torres delivered a eulogy. Rex was not just a dog, she said, her voice carrying across the assembly. He was a hero, he was an officer, he was a teacher, and most importantly, he was a friend to a man who sacrificed everything for integrity. When Rex barked its casket, he wasn't grieving a partner. He was performing his final duty, alerting to evidence that could not be found any other way. That alert changed our department, changed our city, changed our country. It led to reforms that will protect officers and communities for generations to come. We are forever grateful for Rex's service, and we honor him as we honor all who gave their lives, in whatever form that sacrifice took. After the service, Susan placed a photograph of Rex and beside the bronze statue. The photograph showed them together in happier times, arm around Rex's shoulder, both of them looking toward the future with hope and determination. The photograph became a fixture at the memorial, regularly updated as seasons changed and visitors left flowers and written tributes. The story of the dog who barked at the police officer's casket had become legend in law enforcement circles. Police academies across the country used it as their foundational teaching tool. Officers facing the choice between speaking up and remaining silent would remember Rex's alert and find courage. Families would learn about and Susan and understand that their sacrifices had meaning. In the years that followed, the ripple effects of sacrifice continued to expand. A documentary titled The Last Alert had won critical acclaim and several awards. A book by the prosecutor had become required reading in criminal justice programs. National news networks had created hour-long specials examining police corruption and protection. But perhaps most meaningfully, its legacy had changed the culture of policing itself. Slowly, gradually, the message had taken root, that integrity was not weakness, that speaking up was not disloyalty, that doing what was right was more important than protecting the institution or maintaining the brotherhood. Young officers entering the profession had been shaped by his example. They knew his story, understood his sacrifice, and carried his principles into their work. 5 years after his death, on what would have been 60th birthday, Susan stood before the bronze statue one final time. She was no longer the grieving widow struggling to understand her loss. She had transformed into a powerful advocate, a voice for accountability, a champion of integrity within law enforcement. She had built something meaningful from tragedy. "Thank you," she whispered to the statue, to his memory, to Rex's eternal loyalty. "Thank you for showing us the way. Thank you for reminding us that integrity never truly dies, that it lives in the choices we make, the stands we take, and the principles we're willing to defend." As she walked away from the memorial, flanked by officers and advocates who had become her friends, the inscription on the statue caught the afternoon light. "Integrity never dies." And it didn't. As long as officers chose to do what was right, as long as we're protected, as long as corruption faced consequences, would live. As long as young people learned that one person's courage could change an entire system, Rex's bark would echo through the corridors of police agencies worldwide. The dog had barked, the message had been heard, and the world had been changed forever.